In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a scream pierces the night. A priceless manuscript vanishes, and Sir Reginald Haverford lies dead, a letter-opener in his chest. Who among the elegant guests, his fragile wife, his defiant daughter, the ambitious publisher, or the secretive scholar, hides a deadly secret? As whispers of greed and betrayal swirl, only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, can unravel the truth. But what dark motives lurk behind closed doors? And will she uncover the killer before another strike? Step into a world of suspense, where every clue counts, and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The tranquil facade of Blackthorn Manor. In the waning light of an October afternoon in 1938, Blackthorn Manor stood as a monument to understated elegance, nestled in the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, England. Its ivy-clad stone walls, punctuated by tall mullioned windows, gleamed with the patina of centuries, yet the air around it seemed to hum with a quiet unease. The manor belonged to Sir Reginald Haverford, a retired diplomat whose penchant for collecting rare manuscripts was rivaled only by his reputation for hosting lavish, if peculiar, gatherings. This weekend, as autumn leaves swirled across the manicured lawns, the house was alive with guests, each drawn by Sir Reginald's promise of unveiling a newly acquired treasure. A 16th-century illuminated manuscript said to be worth a fortune. The drawing-room, where the guests had gathered for pre-dinner drinks, was a study in contrasts. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished mahogany, while the crackling fire in the hearth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung over the assembly. Sir Reginald, a wiry man of 60, with a hawkish nose and eyes that missed nothing, stood at the centre holding court with a glass of sherry. His wife, Lady Eleanor, a pale, delicate woman of 40, hovered near the fireplace, her fingers nervously twisting the pearls at her throat. Their daughter Clara, a spirited young woman of 22, with chestnut curls and a defiant glint in her eye, leaned against a bookcase, her gaze darting between her parents. Among the guests were Dr. Malcolm Price, a scholarly physician with a penchant for rare books, whose quiet demeanour belied a sharp intellect. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, a widowed socialite whose charm was as calculated as her crimson lipstick. And Mr. Victor Crane, a brash young publisher with ambitions far exceeding his modest means. Rounding out the party was Miss Jane Marple, a slight, elderly spinster from St. Mary Mead, invited at the last moment to replace a guest who had fallen ill. Her presence, marked by a quiet dignity and a pair of knitting needles that clicked rhythmically in her lap, seemed almost incidental. Yet her pale blue eyes, bright with curiosity, missed nothing. The conversation turned to the manuscript, housed in a locked glass case in Sir Reginald's study. "A marvel!" declared, his voice rich with pride. "The Book of Hours, penned by a monk in 1523, its illuminations as vivid as the day they were painted. Tomorrow I shall reveal it to you all." His words were met with murmurs of anticipation, though Miss Marple noted the flicker of envy in Victor Crane's eyes, and the way Beatrice Langley's smile tightened. Dinner was served at precisely 7:30 p.m., as recorded by the ormolu clock on the mantel. The meal, roast pheasant, glazed carrots and a fine claret, was impeccable, yet the atmosphere grew strained. Clara excused herself abruptly at 8:15, claiming a headache, though Miss Marple observed her slip a folded note into her pocket as she left. By 9 o'clock, the guests had retired to the drawing-room once more, where Sir Reginald proposed a game of bridge. Dr. Price declined, citing fatigue, and retired at 9:30. Beatrice Langley, however, lingered, her laughter growing sharper as the evening wore on. At 10:15, a scream shattered the quiet. It came from the study, where Lady Eleanor stood, her face ashen, pointing to the glass case. The manuscript was gone, and Sir Reginald lay slumped over his desk, a letter-opener protruding from his chest. Blood pooled on the blotter, staining the papers beneath. The ormolu clock, still ticking, marked the time, 10:17 p.m. The guests rushed in, their faces a tableau of shock and suspicion. Victor Crane, arriving last, seemed oddly flushed, his tie askew. Clara, pale but composed, clutched her mother's arm. Dr. Price knelt beside the body, pronouncing Sir Reginald dead from a single precise stab wound. Beatrice Langley, clutching a handkerchief, whispered, "Who could have done this?" Her voice trembling, though her eyes were dry. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the door, observed the scene with her usual calm. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap, but her mind was already at work, cataloguing the details. The locked study door, the open window, the faint smudge of crimson on the letter-opener's handle. "A tragedy," she murmured, though her tone suggested she saw something more. A puzzle, intricate and deliberate, waiting to be unravelled. The local constable, a flustered young man named Jenkins, arrived by 10:45, securing the scene and muttering about calling Scotland Yard. Miss Marple, however, needed no such authority. She had seen enough of human nature in St. Mary Mead to know that beneath the polished surface of Blackthorn Manor, secrets were stirring, secrets that would lead to the truth, if only one knew where to look. As the guests dispersed to their rooms under Jenkins' watchful eye, Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, her fingers resuming their knitting. The click of her needles was the only sound in the silent house, save for the distant toll of the village church bell, marking 11 p.m. She thought of the manuscript, the letter-opener, and the fleeting glance Clara had cast at Victor Crane. "Most curious," she said softly to herself. "Most curious indeed." Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Crime. The morning after Sir Reginald Haverford's murder, Blackthorn Manor seemed to hold its breath. The golden light of dawn filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long shadows across the oak-panelled corridors. But the warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the household. The guests, summoned to the drawing-room at 8 a.m. by Constable Jenkins, sat in uneasy silence, their faces etched with fatigue and suspicion. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, and the faint lingering tang of fear. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the window, appeared as composed as ever. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension in the room. She had risen early, as was her habit, and had already taken a quiet turn about the manor's grounds, noting the dew-soaked grass near the study window and the faint imprint of a heel in the flower-bed below. Now, her pale blue eyes surveyed the gathering, taking in every detail. The way Lady Eleanor's hands trembled as she poured tea, the defiant tilt of Clara's chin, the nervous tick in Victor Crane's jaw. Constable Jenkins, his notebook clutched like a lifeline, stood by the fireplace, attempting to assert authority despite his youth. "Scotland Yard has been notified," he announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Inspector Grayson will arrive by noon. Until then, no one is to leave the manor. I've secured the study, and the body remains where it was found." A murmur rippled through the room. Beatrice Langley, her crimson lipstick reapplied but her eyes shadowed, dabbed at her face with a lace handkerchief. "This is dreadful," she said, her voice low and theatrical. "Poor Reginald, and that manuscript gone. It's too much to bear." Dr. Malcolm Price, sitting stiffly on a velvet settee, adjusted his spectacles. "The manuscript's theft and the murder must be connected," he said, his tone measured. "Sir Reginald was meticulous about its security. The lock on that case was no trifling thing." Clara Haverford, standing by the window, turned sharply. "You're suggesting someone here stole it?" Her voice was sharp, almost accusing, and Miss Marple noted the way her gaze flickered toward Victor Crane, who sat slouched in an armchair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "Now, Clara, let's not jump to conclusions," Lady Eleanor said softly, though her words lacked conviction. Her hands, still clutching the teapot, shook so violently that a few drops spilled onto the tray. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly as she spoke, her voice gentle but clear. "It is curious, is it not, that the manuscript should vanish at the precise moment of Sir Reginald's death? One might almost think the crime was planned to coincide with the distraction of the evening's gaiety." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the elderly spinster. "Victor," Crane sat up, his face reddening. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? That one of us is a murderer and a thief?" "Not implying, Mr. Crane," Miss Marple replied calmly, her eyes meeting his. "Merely observing. In my experience, the truth often hides in the smallest details. The things we overlook because they seem unimportant." Jenkins, clearly out of his depth, cleared his throat. "Right. Well, I'll need statements from everyone. Where were you all between 9:30 and 10:17 last night?" The alibis came haltingly, each guest offering their account with varying degrees of confidence. Lady Eleanor claimed she was in the drawing-room until 10 o'clock, then retired to her room, though she admitted to passing the study door around 10:10 and hearing nothing unusual. Clara said she had gone to her room at 8:15 with her headache and remained there, though she could not account for the exact time. Dr. Price repeated that he had retired at 9:30, reading in his room until he heard the scream. Beatrice Langley insisted she had been playing bridge with Victor Crane until 10 o'clock, after which she lingered in the drawing-room alone, admiring the tapestries. Victor Crane's account was less steady. "I was with Mrs. Langley until about 10 o'clock. Then I stepped out to the terrace for a cigarette. I came back just before the scream. Must have been 10:15 or so." His eyes darted to Clara, who looked away. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm as she listened, her mind cataloguing the timelines. The terrace, she recalled, was directly accessible from the study's French windows. And that smudge of crimson on the letter opener, could it be lipstick? Beatrice Langley's, perhaps? Or something else entirely? At 10 a.m., Jenkins allowed the guests to disperse, though he stationed a young officer at the manor's front door. Miss Marple, however, requested permission to view the study, citing a desire to understand the tragedy better. Jenkins, flustered but respectful of her reputation in St. Mary Mead, reluctantly agreed. The study was as she had seen it the previous night, save for the stark presence of Sir Reginald's body, now covered with a sheet. The glass case stood empty, its lock intact, but the hinges pried open with precision. The letter opener, still embedded in the body, bore that faint crimson smudge. Miss Marple bent closer, her eyes narrowing. "Not lipstick," she murmured to herself. "Wax, perhaps, or paint." She noted the open window, the curtains undisturbed, and the faint scuff on the sill, as if something or someone had brushed against it. Returning to the drawing room, she found Clara alone, staring out at the gardens. "Miss Marple," the young woman said, her voice low. "You've seen things like this before, haven't you? In the village?" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but probing. "Human nature is much the same, whether in a village or a manor. People hide their fears, their loves, their hatreds, but they always leave traces." Clara's lips parted, as if to speak, but she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the folded note Miss Marple had seen the previous night. Before she could press further, Victor Crane entered, his expression guarded. "Clara, your mother's asking for you," he said curtly. Clara nodded and left, but not before Miss Marple caught the glance that passed between them, a glance heavy with unspoken meaning. As noon approached, the distant sound of a car announced Inspector Grayson's arrival. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind turning over the clues. The crimson smudge, the pried lock, the heel print in the flower bed, the note in Clara's pocket. The truth, she thought, is like a tapestry. One must follow every thread, no matter how small, to see the pattern. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Miss Marple's Insight. By noon, the atmosphere in Blackthorn Manor had thickened with a palpable sense of dread, as though the very walls were holding secrets too heavy to bear. The crunch of gravel under tires announced the arrival of Inspector Grayson, a stout, middle-aged man with a bristling moustache and a no-nonsense demeanour. He strode into the drawing-room at precisely 12:05 p.m., his sharp eyes scanning the assembled guests who had been summoned once more by Constable Jenkins. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in her corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the inspector with quiet interest. She had encountered men like Grayson before, competent, methodical, but often blind to the subtleties of human nature. Inspector Grayson wasted no time. "A grim business, this," he began, his voice clipped. "Sir Reginald Haverford, stabbed in his own study, and a priceless manuscript stolen. I'll need to speak with each of you individually, starting with Lady Eleanor. Constable, ensure no one leaves the premises." As the guests murmured their assent, Miss Marple noted the way Victor Crane's fingers twitched, as if longing for another cigarette, and the faint flush on Clara Haverford's cheeks, as she avoided the inspector's gaze. Lady Eleanor, pale and trembling, rose to follow Grayson to the library, where he had set up his temporary office. Beatrice Langley, ever the picture of poised distress, adjusted her silk scarf and whispered something to Dr. Malcolm Price, who nodded curtly. Miss Marple, though not officially involved, had a way of making herself unobtrusive yet indispensable. She approached Constable Jenkins with a gentle smile. "Might I take another look at the study, young man? I find that a second glance often reveals what the first overlooks." Jenkins, flustered but deferential to the elderly lady's reputation, nodded, and Miss Marple made her way to the scene of the crime. The study, bathed in the cold light of midday, felt even more oppressive than it had the previous night. Sir Reginald's body had been removed, but the blood-stained blotter remained, along with the empty glass case and the letter opener, now bagged as evidence. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the crimson smudge she had noted before. She bent closer, her magnifying glass, kept in her reticule for just such occasions, revealing that the smudge was indeed not lipstick, but a waxy residue, faintly scented with beeswax. "A candle, perhaps," she murmured. "But why here, and why so carefully applied?" She turned her attention to the window, where the scuff mark on the sill caught her eye again. Kneeling with surprising agility for her age, she examined the flower bed below through the open pane. The heel print she had seen earlier was clearer now, a small pointed mark, suggesting a woman's shoe. Yet the dew on the grass was undisturbed beyond a narrow radius, as if the intruder had not ventured far. "Curious," she said softly, "very curious." Returning to the drawing-room, she found Inspector Grayson emerging from his interview with Lady Eleanor, who looked even more fragile, her eyes red-rimmed. Grayson, noting Miss Marple's presence, gave her a curt nod. "Miss Marple, I understand you've a knack for these things. Care to share any observations?" "Oh, I'm merely an old woman who notices things," she replied, her tone mild. "But I wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the timing of the crime. The scream at 10:15 p.m., the clock marking 10:17. It suggests a very precise act, does it not?" Grayson frowned, jotting a note. "Precise, yes. The wound was clean, one thrust straight to the heart. Whoever did this knew what they were about." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "And the manuscript, a heavy thing, I imagine, to carry through a window." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "You think the thief didn't leave through the window?" "I think," she said, "that we must consider all possibilities. The window was open, yes, but the lock on the case was tampered with from the inside. A thief from without would need time that a murderer, already in the room, might not allow." The inspector grunted, clearly intrigued but unwilling to admit it. He called for Doctor Price next, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She turned her attention to the guests who had scattered into small groups. Clara stood by the fireplace, her fingers twisting the same folded note Miss Marple had seen the previous night. Victor Crane, pacing near the terrace doors, lit a cigarette, his hands unsteady. Beatrice Langley, meanwhile, engaged Lady Eleanor in hushed conversation, her gestures overly solicitous. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the fragments. The note in Clara's pocket, had it been intended for someone? Victor, perhaps, given their charged glances. And the waxy smudge? Could it be from a candle used to light the study during the theft? Or something more deliberate? She recalled the manor's layout, mentally, mapping the corridors. The study was accessible from the terrace, yes, but also from a side passage leading to the servants' quarters, where a small staircase descended from the guest wing. At 1:30 p.m., as Grayson continued his interviews, Miss Marple slipped away to explore this passage. It was narrow, dimly lit, and lined with faded portraits of Haverford ancestors. At the foot of the staircase, she found a small door leading to the terrace, its latch worn but functional. On the floor, barely noticeable, was a tiny fleck of wax, identical to the smudge on the letter opener. She pocketed it carefully, her lips pursing in thought. Returning to the drawing-room, she overheard Victor Crane speaking to Clara in low, urgent tones. "You mustn't say anything," he hissed. "It's too dangerous." Clara's response was inaudible, but her expression was one of defiance, mingled with fear. As the clock struck 2 p.m., Inspector Grayson emerged from the library, his notebook filled with scribbled alibis. "Dr. Price confirms he was in his room from 9:30 onward," he announced. "Mrs. Langley claims she was in the drawing room until 10:15, though no one can confirm after 10 o'clock. Mr. Crane, your turn." Victor's face tightened, but he followed Grayson without protest. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, considered the alibis. Dr. Price's was solid, if unverified. Beatrice's was vague, and Victor's, well, his time on the terrace placed him perilously close to the study. And Clara? Her headache had kept her upstairs, but for how long? The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the gaps, those unaccounted minutes, those fleeting glances, that waxy smudge. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry's cook, who once hid a stolen brooch in a jar of preserves, thinking it safe because no one looked there. People, she mused, are so very careless with their secrets. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Blackthorn Manor's drawing room, where the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and unspoken accusations. By 2:30 p.m., Inspector Grayson had completed his initial interviews, his notebook brimming with contradictory timelines and guarded statements. The guests, now permitted a brief respite, lingered in uneasy clusters, their conversations hushed and strained. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her knitting, appeared as serene as ever, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The way Clara Haverford's fingers tightened around her teacup, the fleeting glance Victor Crane cast toward the terrace, the calculated poise in Beatrice Langley's posture. Inspector Grayson, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, approached Miss Marple, his expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "You've been watching, Miss Marple," he said, his tone gruff but respectful. "Anything you'd care to share? These alibis are a tangle, and I'm not convinced any of them are telling the whole truth." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up with a gentle smile. "Oh, Inspector, I find that people rarely tell the whole truth at first. They're like my nephew's sketches, full of lines that seem clear but lead nowhere until you see the pattern. Perhaps you might ask about the small things. A sound, a scent, a moment they thought no one noticed." Grayson frowned, clearly unused to such cryptic advice, but he nodded and turned to address the group. "Right then. I'll need to speak with each of you again, starting with Miss Haverford. Let's go over those timelines once more." Clara, summoned to the library, rose with a defiant tilt of her chin, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands. As the young woman passed, the folded note in her pocket, still unmentioned, caught Miss Marple's eye once more. It was a small detail, but in her experience, small details were the threads that unraveled the tightest knots. While Grayson conducted his interviews, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe the others. Dr. Malcolm Price sat apart, his scholarly demeanour intact but his fingers drumming restlessly on the arm of his chair. Beatrice Langley, reapplying her crimson lipstick in a small hand mirror, seemed to be performing for an invisible audience, her movements deliberate. Victor Crane, meanwhile, paced near the terrace doors, his cigarette smoke curling into the air like a signal of unease. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the study. The waxy smudge on the letter opener, the heel print in the flower bed, the fleck of wax in the servants' passage. She had also noticed, during her earlier inspection, a faint scratch on the study's oak floor, near the desk, as if something heavy had been dragged a short distance. The manuscript, perhaps? Or something else entirely? She resolved to revisit the scene, but first she needed to test her suspicions. Approaching Lady Eleanor, who sat pale and withdrawn on a velvet settee, Miss Marple spoke softly. "My dear, it must be dreadful for you, this waiting. I wonder, did you notice anything unusual last night, before the tragedy? A sound, perhaps, or someone in the corridor?" Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or guilt. I don't recall," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in the drawing-room until 10. Then I went to my room. I passed the study, as I told the inspector, but it was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. "And your daughter Clara? She retired early, did she not? Poor thing with her headache. Did she mention anything to you before she left the dining-room?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, her fingers twisting her pearls. "No. She was upset, I think. She and Reginald had argued earlier about her engagement to Victor. He disapproved, you see, but Clara would never—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her lips trembling. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Of course, my dear. These things are always clearer in hindsight." But as she returned to her knitting, her thoughts were racing. An argument between Clara and her father, over Victor Crane no less. And that note in Clara's pocket, could it be related? She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's secret letter had revealed a motive for theft, though not murder. Human nature, she mused, is so very predictable. At 3:15 p.m., Grayson emerged from the library with Clara, whose face was flushed but composed. He called for Victor Crane next, and Miss Marple noted the young man's reluctance as he followed the inspector. Seizing the moment, she slipped back to the study, where Constable Jenkins stood guard. "Just a quick look, young man," she said with a disarming smile. "Old ladies are curious, you know." Inside, she examined the scratch on the floor more closely. It ran parallel to the desk, ending near a heavy bookcase. Kneeling, she peered beneath it and spotted a small, crumpled piece of paper, half hidden in the dust. With a deft movement, she retrieved it. A torn fragment of a letter, bearing the words, "Must act tonight," in a hurried scrawl. The ink was fresh, the paper crisp. Tucking it into her reticule, she straightened, her mind turning over the implications. Back in the drawing-room, she overheard Beatrice Langley speaking to Dr. Price in low tones. "It's absurd," Beatrice was saying, her voice sharp. "Reginald was alive when I left the drawing-room at 10. I saw him through the study door, working at his desk. Whoever did this must have come after." Dr. Price nodded, but his eyes were wary. "And yet, Beatrice, you were alone after 10. No one can confirm your whereabouts." Beatrice's laugh was brittle. "Are you accusing me, Malcolm? I had no reason to harm Reginald. My interest was in the manuscript, not his life." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Beatrice's claim to have seen Sir Reginald alive at 10 was new, and contradicted Lady Eleanor's statement that the study was silent at 10:10. One of them was mistaken, or lying, and the fragment of letter, "Must act tonight," suggested a plan, premeditated and precise. As the clock struck 4 p.m., Grayson returned, his expression grim. "Mr. Crane's story is shaky," he muttered to Jenkins. "Says he was on the terrace from 10 to 10:15, but no one saw him. And his cigarette case, it's engraved with his initials, and I found it near the study window." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A cigarette case, a waxy smudge, a torn letter, a heel print, each a thread in the tapestry of the crime. She thought of her friend, Mrs. Clement, whose gardener had once hidden a stolen watch in a flower pot, thinking it safe. "People," she said softly to herself, "are so very careless with their guilt." Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. By late afternoon, Blackthorn Manor seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, as if the very walls were whispering secrets to those who knew how to listen. The clock in the drawing-room struck 4:30 p.m., its chimes echoing through the strained silence of the gathered guests. Inspector Grayson, his face etched with frustration, had just concluded his second round of interviews, and the weight of conflicting alibis hung heavily in the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her characteristic calm, her pale blue eyes darting from face to face, cataloguing every nervous gesture and guarded glance. Grayson, pacing before the fireplace, addressed the group with a stern authority. "We've a murder and a theft on our hands," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "And someone in this room knows more than they're letting on. Mr. Crane's cigarette case, found near the study window, places him at the scene or close to it. Care to explain, Mr. Crane?" Victor Crane slouched in an armchair, stiffened, his face flushing a deep crimson. "I told you, Inspector. I was on the terrace a-smoking. I must have dropped the case earlier in the evening. It's not proof of anything." His voice was defiant, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward Clara Haverford, who sat rigidly by her mother, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Clara's voice broke the silence, sharp and defensive. "Victor wouldn't do this. He and Father argued, yes, but it was about business, not murder. You're barking up the wrong tree, Inspector." Her outburst drew a gasp from Lady Eleanor, whose pearls clicked as her fingers twisted them nervously. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "And you, Miss Haverford? You claim you were in your room from 8:15 onward, but no one can confirm it. That note in your pocket, care to show it to me?" Clara's hand flew to her pocket, her face paling. It's private," she stammered. "Nothing to do with this." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The note, still unproduced, had become a focal point, and Clara's reluctance to share it only deepened its significance. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's diary had held the key to a theft, though the truth had been buried beneath layers of misdirection. People, she thought, so often point us to the wrong villain, whether by design or accident. Grayson, sensing a lead, pressed on. "Private or not, Miss Haverford, I'll need to see it, and Mr. Crane, your cigarette case isn't the only thing tying you to the scene. A groundskeeper saw a figure on the terrace at 10:10, and your alibi doesn't hold water past 10 o'clock. Victor's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Beatrice Langley interjected, her voice smooth as silk. "Inspector, surely you don't think Victor capable of such a brutal act? He's ambitious, yes, but not a killer. Why, I saw Sir Reginald, alive at 10 as I told you. If Victor was on the terrace, He couldn't have been in the study. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Beatrice's repeated insistence on seeing Sir Reginald alive at 10 o'clock was curious, especially given Lady Eleanor's claim that the study was silent by 10:10. One of them was mistaken, or lying, and Victor's cigarette case, so conveniently found near the window, felt almost too perfect, like a clue planted to mislead. In her experience, such obvious evidence often served as a red herring, diverting attention from the true culprit. Seizing a moment of distraction as Grayson turned to confer with Constable Jenkins, Miss Marple approached Dr. Malcolm Price, who sat quietly, his scholarly air tinged with unease. "Dr. Price," she said softly, "you are a man of observation, I think. Did you notice anything last night, perhaps in the drawing-room, that seemed out of place? A guest's behaviour, a sound, a detail?" Dr. Price adjusted his spectacles, his expression guarded. "I retired early, Miss Marple, as I told the inspector. I heard nothing until the scream at 10:15, but—" He hesitated, glancing toward Beatrice Langley. Mrs. Langley was unusually animated during bridge. She kept glancing at the clock, as if waiting for something. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Most interesting," she said. "Time, you see, is such a telling thing. People think it hides their actions, but it often betrays them." As the afternoon wore on, Grayson's focus on Victor Crane intensified. The cigarette case, coupled with the groundskeeper's sighting, painted him as the prime suspect, and the inspector's questions grew sharper. Yet Miss Marple, watching from her corner, felt a growing certainty that the truth lay elsewhere. The waxy smudge on the letter opener, the torn letter fragment reading, "Must act tonight," the heel print in the flower bed, all pointed to a more intricate plot, one that relied on timing and misdirection. At 5 p.m., she requested another look at the study, accompanied by Jenkins. The room, now stripped of its grim centerpiece, felt oddly sterile, but the details remained vivid. The scratch on the floor, the empty glass case, the scuff on the windowsill. Kneeling by the bookcase, she examined the spot where she had found the letter fragment. There, caught in a crack in the wood, was another tiny fleck of wax, identical to the one in the servants' passage. "A candle," she murmured, "used in haste, perhaps, to light a task that required precision." She stood, her mind turning to the manuscript. Its weight, Sir Reginald had described it as a heavy, leather-bound volume, would make it difficult to carry through a window without leaving more obvious traces. Could it still be in the house, hidden in plain sight? She thought of her neighbour, Mrs. Price, who once concealed a stolen necklace in a vase, thinking no one would look there. The simplest hiding places, she mused, are often the most effective. Returning to the drawing-room, she overheard Clara whispering to Victor near the terrace doors. "You mustn't tell them about the note," Clara said, her voice low and urgent. "It'll only make things worse." Victor's reply was sharp. "Worse? Clara, they think I did it. If you'd just—" Their conversation broke off as they noticed Miss Marple's approach. She smiled benignly, but her mind was alert. The note, the cigarette case, Beatrice's convenient alibi, all were threads in a tapestry that was beginning to take shape. As the clock struck 5:30 p.m., Grayson announced a break for tea, but Miss Marple knew there would be no rest for her little grey cells. The red herrings were piling up, but the truth, she felt, was closer than anyone suspected. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. As the clock in Blackthorn Manor's drawing room chimed 6 p.m., the fading light of the October evening cast an eerie glow over the gathered guests. The tension, already palpable, had deepened with Inspector Grayson's relentless focus on Victor Crane, whose cigarette case and shaky alibi marked him as the prime suspect. Yet Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting needles clicking steadily, sensed that the truth lay not in the obvious, but in the overlooked. A single detail that would unravel the carefully woven deception. The drawing room was a study in strained politeness. Lady Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, sipped her tea with trembling hands, while Clara Haverford sat rigidly beside her, her eyes darting to Victor, who stood by the terrace doors, lighting yet another cigarette. Beatrice Langley, her crimson lipstick a stark contrast to her feigned distress, engaged Dr. Malcolm Price in murmured conversation, her gestures calculated. Inspector Grayson, pacing before the fireplace, seemed on the verge of a breakthrough, or a dead end. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the study, where the waxy smudge on the letter opener and the torn letter fragment, "Must act tonight," had piqued her curiosity. The fleck of wax in the servants' passage, identical to the smudge, suggested a candle had been used, but for what purpose? And the heel print in the flower bed, small and pointed, hinted at a woman's presence near the study window. These were not random clues, but pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that one detail, properly understood, would bring the others into focus. She rose, her movements deliberate, and approached Inspector Grayson, who was scribbling in his notebook. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of experience, "might I suggest examining the study's bookcase more closely? There is a scratch on the floor nearby, and I believe it may tell us something." Grayson, though sceptical, respected the elderly spinster's reputation. "A scratch, you say? Very well, Miss Marple. Let's have a... Here, look!" He signalled to Constable Jenkins, and the three made their way to the study, where the air still held the faint metallic tang of blood. The study was as Miss Marple had last seen it, save for the absence of Sir Reginald's body. The empty glass case gleamed under the lamplight, its pried hinges a testament to a thief's precision. Miss Marple pointed to the scratch on the oak floor, a faint line running from the desk to the bookcase. "Here, Inspector," she said. "It suggests something heavy was moved, perhaps the manuscript or something else." Grayson knelt, his eyes narrowing. "Could be the desk chair, dragged in a struggle," he mused, but Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. The chair's legs are rounded, and this mark is sharp, as if made by a corner, perhaps a box or a book." She gestured to the bookcase, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. "Might we look behind it? In my village, I once knew a gentleman who hid his wife's jewels behind a shelf, thinking it clever." With Jenkins' help, Grayson shifted the heavy bookcase, revealing a narrow gap. There, wedged against the wall, was a small brass key, its surface gleaming faintly. Grayson picked it up, frowning. "This isn't the key to the glass case. That one's still in Sir Reginald's pocket." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Inspector, but it may unlock something else. A drawer, a box, perhaps even a secret. Keys, you see, are such personal things. They tell us what someone wished to protect." Back in the drawing room, Grayson clutched the key, his mind clearly racing. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, observed the guests with renewed interest. Clara's fingers hovered near her pocket, where the note remained hidden. Victor Crane, his cigarette case now confiscated as evidence, seemed restless, his eyes darting to the clock, which read 6:30 p.m. Beatrice Langley, meanwhile, had grown unusually quiet, her usual vivacity replaced by a guarded stillness. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the waxy smudge. The scent of beeswax suggested a candle, but the manor was well lit with electric lamps. Why use a candle unless the act required secrecy, or occurred during a brief power fluctuation? She recalled a faint flicker in the drawing-room lights around 9:45 p.m. the previous night, unnoticed by most, but significant to her. Had someone extinguished the study's lamp to work in darkness, using a candle to avoid detection? Approaching Dr. Price, who sat alone with a medical journal, Miss Marple spoke softly. "Dr. Price, you are a man of science. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about the lighting last night? A flicker, perhaps, around 9:45. Dr. Price looked up, startled. "The lighting? Well, now that you mention it, there was a brief dimming during bridge. I thought it was my eyes, but Mrs. Langley remarked on it too. Said it gave her a chill." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking faster. The flicker, the wax, the key, all pointed to a deliberate act, timed to exploit a moment of darkness. She thought of her friend Mrs. Hartnell, whose maid had once used a candle to sneak into a locked pantry, leaving wax drippings that betrayed her. Details, she mused, are the fingerprints of the soul. As Grayson prepared to question Victor Crane again, Miss Marple slipped back to the servants' passage, where she had found the wax fleck. There, near the small door to the terrace, she noticed a faint smudge of dirt on the wall, at knee height, as if someone had brushed against it while crouching. Bending down, she found another tiny fragment of paper bearing a single word: "Tonight." It matched the earlier fragment, confirming her suspicion of a torn letter. But whose? Returning to the drawing-room, she overheard Beatrice Langley speaking to Lady Eleanor in hushed tones. "Eleanor, you mustn't let Clara take the blame. She's young, impulsive, but not a killer. Reginald's temper pushed her too far, that's all." Lady Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Beatrice, you go too far. Clara loved her father, despite their quarrels. You, of all people, should understand discretion." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Beatrice's words were calculated, deflecting suspicion onto Clara while feigning concern. The red herrings were multiplying, but the brass key, the wax and the torn letter were leading her closer to the truth. As the clock struck 7 p.m., she knew the next hours would be critical. The tapestry was taking shape, and one small detail would soon bring it into sharp relief. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The evening of October 22nd, 1938, settled over Blackthorn Manor like a heavy fog, the air thick with suspicion and the faint chill of autumn. By 7:30 p.m., the drawing-room was a crucible of tension, the guests' faces illuminated by the flickering firelight as they awaited Inspector Grayson's next move. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, observed the scene with her usual calm, though her mind was a whirl of connections. The brass key, the waxy smudge, the torn letter fragments. Each clue was a thread in the tapestry of Sir Reginald Haverford's murder. And now, new strands of deceit were beginning to emerge. Inspector Grayson, his moustache twitching with impatience, stood before the group, clutching the brass key Miss Marple had found behind the bookcase. "This key," he declared, holding it aloft, Doesn't fit the glass case or any door in the study. But it unlocks something in this house, and I mean to find out what. Someone here knows more than they're saying." His eyes lingered on Victor Crane, whose cigarette case and terrace alibi had made him the focal point of suspicion. Victor slouched in an armchair, met Grayson's gaze with defiance. "I've told you everything, Inspector. I was on the terrace, smoking from 10 to 10:15. I didn't kill Sir Reginald, and I didn't steal that blasted manuscript." Clara Haverford, sitting beside her mother, sprang to her feet. "Stop hounding him!" she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. "Victor had no reason to harm Father. They argued, yes, but it was about publishing rights, not murder." Her outburst drew a sharp intake of breath from Lady Eleanor, whose fingers tightened around her pearls, snapping the strand. Pearls scattered across the floor, rolling under chairs and tables, and the room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Miss Marple, bending to retrieve a pearl that had rolled near her feet, noted Lady Eleanor's flushed cheeks and trembling hands. "My dear," she said gently, handing the pearl back, "such accidents happen when we are under strain, but sometimes they reveal more than we intend." Her words were kind, but her eyes were sharp, catching the fleeting panic in Lady Eleanor's expression. Grayson, seizing the moment, turned to Clara. "Miss Haverford, you've avoided showing me that note in your pocket. I'll ask again, what's in it, and why are you hiding it?" Clara's hand flew to her pocket, her face paling. It's personal," she stammered. "A letter from a friend. It has nothing to do with this." Miss Marple's needles paused. The note, she suspected, was far more than a personal trifle. The fragments she had found must act tonight, and tonight suggested urgency, a plan, perhaps a conspiracy. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's love letter had concealed a coded message about a theft. Could Clara's note be similar, hiding its true purpose behind innocent words? As Grayson pressed Clara, Beatrice Langley interjected, her voice smooth and calculated. "Inspector, surely you don't suspect poor Clara? She's just a girl, grieving her father. If anyone had a motive, it was someone after that manuscript, someone like Dr. Price, perhaps, with his obsession for rare books." Dr. Malcolm Price, who'd been quietly reading in a corner, looked up sharply, his spectacles glinting. "That's preposterous, Mrs. Langley," he said, his tone icy. "I admired Sir Reginald's collection, yes, but I had no need to steal it. My own library is quite sufficient." Beatrice's smile was brittle. "Oh, Malcolm, don't be so modest. We all know you offered Reginald a fortune for that book of ours last month, and he refused. That must have stung." The room buzzed with whispers, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Beatrice's accusation was a deft deflection, casting suspicion on Dr. Price while diverting attention from herself. Yet her earlier claim of seeing Sir Reginald alive at 10 p.m. still clashed with Lady Eleanor's statement that the study was silent by 10:10, and the waxy smudge on the letter opener, beeswax, not lipstick, hinted at a careful act, perhaps by someone familiar with the manor's routines. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and approached Inspector Grayson. "Inspector," she said softly, "might I suggest checking Sir Reginald's desk drawers? The key you found may belong to something small, a box perhaps, or a hidden compartment. In my village, I once knew a man who kept his secrets in a locked cigar box, thinking it safe." Grayson nodded, intrigued despite himself, and led the way to the study, with Miss Marple and Jenkins in tow. The desk, a heavy mahogany piece, had several drawers, but one, a narrow, shallow compartment beneath the blotter, bore a small lock that matched the brass key. Grayson turned it, and the drawer sprang open, revealing a bundle of papers, financial records, letters, and a single photograph of Clara and Victor Crane, taken in the Manor's gardens, their faces close and smiling. Love letters, perhaps, Grayson mused, rifling through the papers. But Miss Marple's attention was on a single document, a codicil to Sir Reginald's will, dated a week earlier, disinheriting Clara if she married Victor Crane. The ink was fresh, the signature bold. Most interesting, Miss Marple murmured. A motive, perhaps, for more than one person. Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere had grown electric. Grayson, clutching the codicil, confronted Clara. "Did you know about this, Miss Haverford? Your father planned to cut you off if you married Mr. Crane." Clara's eyes widened, and she swayed, gripping the arm of a chair. "No, I didn't. He never told me." Her voice broke, and Victor stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "That's why he was against us," Victor growled. "But I didn't know about this, Inspector, I swear it." Miss Marple watched closely, noting the genuine shock on Clara's face, but the guarded look in Victor's eyes. The codicil was a bombshell, revealing a financial motive for both Clara and Victor, and perhaps others who knew of Sir Reginald's intentions. She thought of Lady Eleanor's broken pearls, Beatrice's deft accusations, and Dr. Price's quiet intensity. Lies were surfacing, each one a thread in the tapestry, but the pattern was still incomplete. As the clock struck 8 p.m., Grayson announced that he would search the guests' rooms for the manuscript, starting with Victor's. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, reflected on the clues. The waxy smudge, the heel print, the torn letter, the brass key, and now the codicil. Secrets, she thought, are like shadows. They grow longer as the light fades. And in Blackthorn Manor, the light was fading fast. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The evening of October 22nd, 1938, cloaked Blackthorn Manor in a shroud of unease, the air heavy with the weight of secrets and the flickering shadows of candlelight. By 8:30 p.m., the drawing room was a tableau of strained faces, each guest grappling with the revelations of the day. Inspector Grayson's discovery of the codicil in Sir Reginald Haverford's desk had cast a new shadow over Clara Haverford and Victor Crane, their motives laid bare by the threat of disinheritance. Yet Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting needles clicking softly, sensed that the true heart of the mystery lay not in the obvious but in the human frailties now beginning to crack. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the occasional clink of a teacup. Lady Eleanor, her composure fraying, sat with her hands clasped tightly, the broken strand of pearls replaced by a simple scarf. Clara, pale and defiant, avoided her mother's gaze, her fingers still guarding the note in her pocket. Victor Crane, under Grayson's relentless scrutiny, paced near the terrace doors, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. Beatrice Langley, her crimson lipstick freshly applied, maintained an air of poised detachment, though her eyes darted toward Dr. Malcolm Price, who sat rigidly, his scholarly calm strained. Inspector Grayson, standing by the fireplace, held up the codicil, his voice sharp. "This document changes everything," he declared. Sir Reginald planned to disinherit Miss Haverford if she married Mr. Crane. That's a motive for murder, plain and simple. And with Mr. Crane's cigarette case found near the study window, I'm inclined to believe we're close to an arrest. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "You're wrong, Inspector. I loved my father even if we argued. And Victor, he couldn't. Her voice broke, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of her emotion palpable. Miss Marple's needles paused, her pale blue eyes softening with sympathy but sharpening with insight. Clara's outburst was genuine, but it was also a crack in the facade, a moment where truth might slip through. She recalled a similar scene in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's tears over a stolen locket had revealed a deeper betrayal. Emotion, she thought, is a window to the soul, but it can also be a mirror, reflecting what we wish others to see. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice trembling but firm. "Inspector, you mustn't accuse my daughter. Clara was in her room all evening. She had no part in this. If you must blame someone, look to those who coveted Reginald's manuscript. Dr. Price, for instance, he was obsessed with it." Dr. Price's spectacles glinted as he stood, his voice cold. "Lady Eleanor, that's slanderous. I respected Sir Reginald's collection, but I had no need to steal it. My own library is well stocked, and I've no motive for murder." Beatrice Langley's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension. "Oh, Malcolm, don't play the saint. We all know you were furious when Reginald outbid you for that book of hours, and you were alone in your room after 9:30. Who's to say you didn't slip into the study?" Miss Marple's lips pursed. Beatrice's accusations, like her earlier deflection toward Clara, were too convenient, too calculated. Yet the room's focus on Dr. Price gave her a moment to reflect on the clues. The waxy smudge on the letter opener, the heel print in the flower bed, the torn letter fragments must act tonight, and the brass key that unlocked the desk drawer. The codicil had revealed a motive, but it was the wax that nagged at her. Why a candle in a house with electric lights? The flicker at 9:45 p.m., noted by Dr. Price and Beatrice, suggested a brief power dip, perhaps deliberate, to create a moment of darkness. Seizing a lull in the conversation, Miss Marple approached Clara, who sat alone, her face streaked with tears. "My dear," she said gently, "this is a dreadful time, I know. But that note in your pocket, it weighs on you, does it not? Sometimes sharing a burden lightens it." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of speaking. Then, with a glance at Victor, she shook her head. "It's nothing, Miss Marple. Just a letter from a friend. It doesn't matter." But it did matter, Miss Marple knew. The note was a key, not of brass but of intent, and Clara's refusal to share it only deepened its significance. She thought of the servant's passage, where the wax fleck and the smudge of dirt suggested a hurried exit or entry. Had someone used that passage to reach the study, avoiding the main corridors? As Grayson prepared to search Victor's room, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where Sir Reginald's collection of rare books lined the walls. She examined the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines, searching for anything out of place. Near the bottom shelf, she found a faint smudge of wax, identical to the others, on the edge of a heavy tome, a history of illuminated manuscripts. Pulling it out, she discovered a hidden recess, empty but bearing the faint outline of a rectangular object, roughly the size of the stolen book of hours. Her heart quickened. The manuscript had been hidden here, she was certain, before being moved again. But by whom? And why leave the wax? It was a careless mistake, or perhaps a deliberate clue, meant to mislead. She recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose gardener had once hidden stolen silver in a hollowed-out book, thinking it safe. People, she mused, are so predictable in their cunning. Returning to the drawing-room, she found Grayson confronting Victor, who stood red-faced and defiant. "We found nothing in your room, Mr. Crane," the inspector said, "but that doesn't clear you. The cigarette case, the codicil, your argument with Sir Reginald, it's all piling up." Victor's voice cracked. "I didn't do it. Yes, I wanted to marry Clara. And yes, Sir Reginald opposed it. But I didn't kill him. Someone's setting me up." Clara's sob broke the silence, and she rushed to Victor's side, clutching his arm. "Tell them, Victor," she whispered, her voice raw. "Tell them about the letter." The room froze, all eyes on the young couple. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her mind racing. The note, Clara's secret, was about to surface, and with it, a piece of the truth. As the clock struck 9 p.m., she knew the tapestry was unraveling, thread by thread, and the emotional cracks in Blackthorn Manor were about to reveal a deeper, darker truth. Chapter 9. The Trap. The clock in Blackthorn Manor's drawing room struck 9 p.m., its chimes reverberating through the tense silence that followed Clara Haverford's outburst. The air was thick with anticipation, the guests' faces a mixture of shock and curiosity, as Clara clutched Victor Crane's arm, her whispered plea, "Tell them about the letter," hanging like a spectre over the room. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting needles still, observed the scene with her characteristic calm, though her mind was alight with the possibilities. The note, the waxy smudges, the hidden recess in the library, all were threads in a tapestry that was now fraying at the edges, and she sensed the moment was ripe to apply a little pressure. Inspector Grayson, his moustache bristling with renewed focus, turned to Clara. "Miss Haverford," he said sharply, "you've mentioned this letter twice now. Produce it, or I'll have no choice but to assume you're hiding evidence." Clara's face paled, her hand trembling as it hovered over her pocket. Victor, his jaw tight, stepped forward. "It's not what you think, Inspector," he said, his voice low but firm. "The letter's from me to Clara. It's personal, about our engagement, nothing to do with the murder." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Victor's explanation was plausible, but his quick intervention suggested he was shielding Clara, or himself. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's love letter had concealed a plan for a robbery, written in code to avoid suspicion. Could the torn fragments she had found, must act tonight and tonight, be part of Victor's letter, or something more sinister? Grayson, unconvinced, extended his hand. "Hand it over, Mr. Crane. If it's as innocent as you claim, you've nothing to fear." Clara hesitated, then slowly withdrew the folded note from her pocket. It was crumpled, the edges worn, as if handled repeatedly. She passed it to Grayson, her eyes brimming with tears. The inspector unfolded it and read aloud, his voice steady but probing. "My dearest Clara, we must act tonight. The future depends on it. Meet me at 10. Yours, Victor." A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor gasped, her scarf slipping from her shoulders. Beatrice Langley's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, while Dr. Malcolm Price adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles remained still, her mind racing. The words matched the fragments she had found, but the tone, urgent, almost desperate, suggested more than a lover's rendezvous. Act tonight could mean many things, from elopement to something far darker. Grayson's eyes gleamed with triumph. "This puts you both at the scene, Mr. Crane, Miss Haverford. You claim you were in your room, Miss Haverford, but this suggests you were to meet Mr. Crane at 10, near the time of the murder." Clara's voice broke. "I didn't go. I meant to, but I stayed in my room. My headache was real, Inspector. I never left. Victor nodded vigorously. She's telling the truth. I waited on the terrace, but she didn't come. I smoked a cigarette and went back inside just before the scream. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The note confirmed a plan, but Clara's absence from the meeting raised new questions. Had Victor acted alone, expecting her help? Or was the note a misdirection, meant to be found? She thought of the waxy smudge on the letter opener, the heel print in the flower bed, and the hidden recess in the library. The manuscript, she suspected, was still in the house, concealed by someone who knew its value. And Sir Reginald's secrets. Sensing the moment was right, Miss Marple rose, her voice gentle but commanding attention. Inspector, might I propose a small experiment? In my village, I once helped resolve a theft by gathering everyone together and observing their reactions. People, you see, reveal themselves when they think the truth is near. Grayson, though sceptical, nodded. Very well, Miss Marple. What do you suggest? She smiled, her eyes bright. Let us gather in the study, all of us, and recreate the moments before the murder. You might announce that you've found a new clue. Perhaps something about the manuscript's hiding place. It will be most illuminating to see who reacts and how. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but Grayson, intrigued, agreed. At 9:30 p.m., the group assembled in the study, the empty glass case and blood-stained blotter a grim reminder of the crime. Miss Marple stood near the bookcase, her reticule clutched in one hand, her knitting left behind. Grayson, taking her cue, addressed the group with authority. We've reason to believe the manuscript is still in the house, he declared, his voice ringing with confidence. A hidden compartment was found in the library, with traces of wax matching the smudge on the letter opener. Someone here knows where it is and why Sir Reginald was killed. The effect was immediate. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her scarf slipping again. Clara's eyes widened, darting to Victor, who stood rigid, his cigarette unlit in his hand. Beatrice Langley's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her handbag. Dr. Price, however, remained calm, though his spectacles glinted as he glanced at the bookcase. Miss Marple watched closely, her mind cataloguing every reaction. The wax, she knew, was the key, not just to the manuscript but to the murder. Someone had used a candle, perhaps to search the study in darkness, and left traces in their haste. The heel print suggested a woman, but the codicil and the note pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to love, money, or betrayal. As Grayson pressed the group with questions about the wax, Beatrice spoke up, her voice sharp. This is absurd, Inspector. You're chasing shadows. If anyone had a reason to hide that manuscript, it was Clara. She stood to lose everything if her father disinherited her. Clara's sob broke the silence, and she turned to Victor, her voice raw. Tell them, Victor. Tell them it wasn't us. Victor's face darkened, but before he could speak, Lady Eleanor stood, her voice trembling but resolute. Enough. Clara is innocent, Inspector. I saw something that night. I didn't want to say, but I saw someone near the study door at 10:05 before I went to my room. It wasn't Clara or Victor. The room froze, all eyes on Lady Eleanor. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The trap had worked. Pressure had loosened a truth, or perhaps another lie. As the clock struck 10 p.m., she knew the next revelation would bring the tapestry's pattern into sharper focus. But the final truth was still just out of reach. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The study of Blackthorn Manor, dimly lit by the electric lamps and the flickering glow of the fireplace, seemed to close in around the gathered guests as the clock struck 10 p.m. on October 22nd, 1938. The air was thick with tension, the weight of Lady Eleanor's revelation that she had seen someone near the study door at 10:05, hanging like a storm cloud over the room. Inspector Grayson, his moustache twitching with anticipation, surveyed the group, his notebook clutched tightly. Miss Jane Marple, standing quietly near the bookcase, her reticule in hand, watched each face with her piercing blue eyes, her mind weaving together the threads of the mystery. The waxy smudge, the heel print, the torn letter fragments, the brass key, and now Lady Eleanor's startling claim. Grayson turned to Lady Eleanor, his voice sharp. "You saw someone, Lady Haverford? Why didn't you mention this before? Who was it?" Lady Eleanor, her scarf clutched tightly, hesitated, her eyes darting toward Clara and Victor Crane. I wasn't sure," she stammered. "It was dark in the corridor, and I only caught a glimpse. But it was a woman, I think, someone in a dark dress." A murmur rippled through the room. Beatrice Langley, her crimson lipstick stark against her pale face, laughed softly. "A woman in a dark dress? That could be half the household, Eleanor. You'll need to do better than that." Clara's voice cut through, trembling but defiant. "Mother, why didn't you say this earlier? You're making it sound like it could be me." Her hand went to her pocket, where the note from Victor had been surrendered to Grayson. Miss Marple's needles, left in the drawing-room, were silent, but her mind was anything but. Lady Eleanor's vague description felt like another layer of misdirection, yet it aligned with the heel print in the flower bed. A woman's shoe, small and pointed. The waxy smudge on the letter opener, the hidden recess in the library, and the torn letter fragments must act tonight and tonight, all pointed to a calculated act. But it was the brass key, unlocking the desk drawer with the codicil, that had shifted the puzzle's shape. She sensed the moment had come to lay bare the truth. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, stepping forward, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. "If I may, I believe we can resolve this matter tonight. The clues, you see, tell a story, not of one crime, but of two, intertwined like threads in a tapestry. Allow me to explain." Grayson, though sceptical, nodded. "Go on, Miss Marple. You've been right about too much for me to ignore you now." She smiled, her eyes sweeping the group. "Let us begin with the manuscript, the Book of Hours. It was the prize Sir Reginald valued most, yet it was stolen from a locked case with pried hinges. The window was open, yes, but the dew on the grass outside was undisturbed beyond a small radius, and the heel print suggests someone stepped out briefly, not to escape with a heavy book, but to create the illusion of an outside thief. The manuscript, I believe, is still in this house." A gasp escaped Lady Eleanor, and Victor Crane's hand froze, his cigarette unlit. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The waxy smudge on the letter opener, scented with beeswax, was not lipstick but from a candle, used during a brief flicker in the lights at 9:45 p.m., noted by Dr. Price and Mrs. Langley. Someone needed light to work in the study, perhaps to pry open the case or search the desk. The same wax was found in the servants' passage, and behind a library book, where a recess held the manuscript briefly before it was moved again." She turned to the bookcase, gesturing to the scratch on the floor. "This mark made by something heavy, suggests the manuscript was hidden here, behind a shelf, before being relocated. But why? To divert suspicion, perhaps, or to buy time. The brass key found behind this bookcase unlocked a drawer containing a codicil, disinheriting Clara if she married Victor Crane. This gave them a motive, but not the only one. Clara's eyes widened, and Victor stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "Miss Marple, you can't think we—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone gentle but firm. "Patience, Mr. Crane. Let us consider the letter. The note Clara carried, signed by you, saying we must act tonight. It was torn, and I found fragments in the study and the servants' passage, suggesting it was discarded in haste. But the note was a misdirection, meant to implicate you both. The true crime, you see, was not about love, but about greed and betrayal." She turned to Beatrice Langley, whose smile had vanished. "Mrs. Langley, you claim to see Sir Reginald alive at 10 p.m., yet Lady Eleanor heard nothing in the study at 10:10. Your lipstick, so carefully applied, is not the crimson of the waxy smudge, but your perfume, scented with rose and sandalwood, matches the faint odour I noticed near the study window. You were there, were you not? Not to kill, but to steal." Beatrice's face paled, but she laughed, a brittle sound. "This is absurd, Miss Marple. I had no reason to steal the manuscript." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Oh, but you did. Sir Reginald outbid you for the Book of Hours, a prize you coveted for your own collection. You knew its value, and you knew his habits. You used the servants' passage to reach the study, lighting a candle during the flicker at 9:45 to pry open the case. You hid the manuscript in the library, planning to retrieve it later. But someone else was in the study that night. Someone who saw your theft and used it to their advantage." She turned to Lady Eleanor, whose hands trembled violently. "Lady Eleanor, you saw Mrs. Langley near the study at 10:05, as you admitted. But you said nothing because you, too, had a secret. The codicil threatened Clara's future, but it also revealed your own financial troubles. Sir Reginald's debts, hidden from the world, were mounting. You needed the manuscript sale to save the estate. When you found him dead, you realized someone had acted before you could." Lady Eleanor's sob broke the silence, and Clara rushed to her side. "Mother, no!" Miss Marple's voice softened. "The true murderer, however, was neither of you. Dr. Price, you were the last to see Sir Reginald alive, were you not? Your obsession with his collection was not just scholarly. You offered to buy the Book of Hours, and when he refused, you saw your chance when Mrs. Langley stole it. You followed her, confronted Sir Reginald, and in a moment of rage stabbed him with the letter opener, wiping it with your handkerchief to leave the waxy residue from your candle-lit research earlier that evening." Dr. Price's face drained of colour, his spectacles slipping. "This is nonsense! I was in my room." Miss Marple shook her head. "The heel print, Dr. Price, was a clever touch. Your wife's shoe taken from her things to suggest a woman's involvement. But the wax, the scratch, and your unguarded glance at the bookcase betrayed you. The manuscript is hidden in your medical bag, wrapped in gauze to disguise its weight." Grayson, stunned, signalled to Jenkins, who retrieved the bag. Inside, wrapped as Miss Marple described, was the Book of Hours. Dr. Price slumped, his confession spilling out in a broken whisper. "He mocked me, said I'd never own it." As the clock struck 10:30 p.m., Grayson arrested Dr. Price, and Miss Marple stepped back, her work done. The tapestry was complete, its threads woven into a pattern of greed, deception, and murder. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The aftermath of Dr. Malcolm Price's confession hung over Blackthorn Manor like a fading storm, leaving a quiet that was both sombre and resolute. It was 10:45 p.m. on October 22nd, 1938, and the study, now emptied of its grim tableau, felt almost serene, the lamplight casting soft shadows on the oak-panelled walls. Inspector Grayson, his notebook finally closed, oversaw the removal of Dr. Price, who shuffled out in handcuffs, his scholarly demeanour shattered by the weight of his guilt. The guests still gathered in the study stood in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Miss Jane Marple, standing quietly near the bookcase, her reticule clasped in her hands, observed the scene with her usual calm, her pale blue eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. The Book of Hours, retrieved from Dr. Price's medical bag, lay on the desk, its leather cover gleaming under the light, a silent witness to the greed and betrayal that had led to Sir Reginald Haverford's death. Clara Haverford, clinging to her mother's arm, wept softly, while Lady Eleanor, her face etched with exhaustion, stared at the manuscript as if seeing it for the first time. Victor Crane, his bravado, restored now that suspicion had lifted, stood close to Clara, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Beatrice Langley, her crimson lipstick faded, sat with a forced composure, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of relief at escaping her own exposure. Inspector Grayson approached Miss Marple, his moustache twitching with a grudging respect. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I'll admit I doubted you at first, but you've a mind sharper than any detective I've met. How did you see through it all? The wax, the key, the heel print?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but tinged with the wisdom of experience. "Oh, Inspector, it is simply a matter of observation and understanding human nature. In my village of St. Mary Mead, I have seen many secrets hidden in plain sight, letters torn in haste, objects misplaced, words spoken too quickly. People, you see, are not so different whether in a manor or a cottage. They leave their traces, and one need only follow them." She gestured to the desk, where the letter opener, now bagged as evidence, had borne the waxy smudge. The wax was the key, not just to the crime, but to the character of the criminal. Dr. Price, a man of precision, used a candle to work in the dark, perhaps to avoid detection during the flicker of the lights at 9:45. But he was careless, leaving traces in the study, the library, and the servants' passage. The heel print borrowed from his late wife's shoe was meant to mislead us toward a woman, Mrs. Langley perhaps, or Clara, but it was too perfect, too staged. Grayson nodded, scribbling a final note. "And the manuscript? You knew it was still in the house?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "A heavy book like that, carried through a window, would have left more than a single heel print in the dew. No, it was hidden, first in the library, then in Dr. Price's bag, disguised as medical supplies. He planned to retrieve it later, when suspicion had settled on others. I once knew a grocer in St. Mary Mead who hid stolen coins in a sack of flour, thinking it clever, but flour, like wax, leaves traces." Lady Eleanor, her voice barely above a whisper, spoke up. "Miss Marple, how did you know I wasn't, that I didn't?" she faltered, her hands trembling. Miss Marple's tone softened. "My dear, your fear was for Clara, not for yourself. Your broken pearls, your hesitation. They spoke of a mother protecting her child, not a murderer. But you saw Mrs. Langley near the study, did you not? And you kept silent to avoid implicating Clara, who might have been nearby. Lady Eleanor nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought it might make things worse for her. Clara, wiping her eyes, looked at Miss Marple with gratitude. You saved us, Miss Marple. Victor and I, we were so afraid. Victor cleared his throat, his voice gruff. I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. I thought you were just a meddling old... Well, you know. But you saw the truth when no one else did. Miss Marple's smile was kind but firm. No apology needed, Mr. Crane. Youth is often quick to judge, but age has its advantages. I have learned that the heart of a crime lies not in the act, but in the reasons behind it. Greed, fear, love, betrayal. Dr. Price's obsession with the manuscript blinded him to reason, just as Mrs. Langley's ambition led her to theft, though not to murder. Beatrice Langley, her composure cracking, stood abruptly. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I only wanted the manuscript. It was a moment of weakness. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you, Mrs. Langley, but your theft set the stage for a greater crime. In my village, I once knew a woman who took a neighbour's silver spoon, thinking it harmless. But small sins, you see, can lead to larger ones. Grayson, signalling to Constable Jenkins, prepared to escort Beatrice for further questioning about the theft. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the study, her eyes resting on the Book of Hours. Such a beautiful thing, she murmured, and yet so costly. She stepped out into the cool night air. The manor's gardens bathed in moonlight. The case was closed, the truth revealed, but her thoughts turned to the fragility of human nature. The desires that drove men and women to destroy what they loved most. We are all, she thought, so very predictable, and yet so very surprising. As she walked toward her room, the distant church bell tolled 11 p.m., marking the end of a long day. Miss Marple's work was done, and Blackthorn Manor, though scarred, would heal. She would return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow, to her quiet cottage and her garden, where new puzzles, no doubt, awaited her little grey cells. Chapter 12. The Unraveling Threads. The morning of October 23rd, 1938, dawned crisp and clear over Blackthorn Manor. The golden light of autumn filtering through the tall windows and casting a deceptive warmth over the sombre household. The events of the previous night, Dr. Malcolm Price's confession and Beatrice Langley's admission of theft, had left the guests in a state of uneasy relief, as if the manor itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Yet Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting resumed, sensed that a few threads of the tapestry remained loose, nagging at her meticulous mind. The truth had been revealed, but its echoes lingered, demanding a final reckoning. The drawing-room was quieter now, the guests subdued as they gathered for breakfast at 8 a.m. Lady Eleanor, her face pale but composed, sat at the head of the table, her scarf replaced by a simple brooch. Clara Haverford, her eyes red-rimmed but hopeful, sat beside Victor Crane, their hands clasped beneath the table. Beatrice Langley, under Constable Jenkins' watchful eye, maintained a brittle poise, her crimson lipstick absent for the first time. Inspector Grayson, sipping coffee, reviewed his notes, his expression one of satisfaction tempered by fatigue. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, observed them all. her pale blue eyes sharp with curiosity. The Book of Hours, now secured in a locked case under Grayson's orders, rested in the library, its presence a reminder of the greed that had sparked the tragedy. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the smaller details. The torn letter fragments, the waxy smudge, the heel print, and Lady Eleanor's hesitant revelation about seeing a woman near the study. These had been explained, but a faint unease persisted, as if the puzzle were complete but for a single misplaced piece. Approaching Inspector Grayson, Miss Marple spoke softly. "Inspector, you have done splendidly, but I wonder if we might clarify one small point. Lady Eleanor's sighting of a woman near the study at 10:05. Could we ask her to describe it again? In my village, I once found that a witness's memory, when gently prodded, reveals more than they first realize." Grayson, though weary, nodded. "Fair enough, Miss Marple. Your hunches have been spot on so far." He turned to Lady Eleanor, who looked up with a start. "Lady Haverford, you said you saw a woman in a dark dress near the study at 10:05. Can you recall anything else? Her height, her manner, perhaps a sound?" Lady Eleanor's hands trembled, and she glanced at Clara before speaking. "It was fleeting, Inspector. The corridor was dark, but I saw a figure, slender, I think, moving quickly toward the servants' passage. I heard a faint rustle, like fabric, and, yes, a clink, as if something metal fell." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the word clink. A metal object, perhaps the brass key, dropped in haste. She recalled the key's discovery behind the bookcase, near the scratch on the floor. Had it been dropped by Beatrice during her theft, or by someone else? She thought of her friend, Mrs. Bantry, whose maid had once dropped a stolen hairpin, betraying her movements. "Small sounds," she mused, "can speak volumes." She rose, her movements deliberate, and addressed the group. "If I may, Inspector, I believe we might resolve this final thread. Lady Eleanor's clink suggests an object dropped in haste, perhaps the key we found. But Mrs. Langley, you were in the study earlier, were you not, to steal the manuscript? Did you carry a key, or hear such a sound?" Beatrice, her composure faltering, shook her head. "I told you, Miss Marple, I used a hairpin to pry the case. I had no key, and I heard nothing. I was in and out before 10 o'clock. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, but the key unlocked the desk drawer, revealing the codicil, a secret someone else wished to uncover. Dr. Price, we know, killed Sir Reginald, but I wonder if another hand placed the key where it was found to ensure its discovery." Clara's voice broke the silence, trembling but clear. "Miss Marple, are you saying someone else was involved? Not just Dr. Price and Mrs. Langley?" Miss Marple turned to her, her tone gentle. "My dear, the human heart is complex. Dr. Price acted out of greed, Mrs. Langley out of ambition. But the codicil, your father's threat to disinherit you, stirred other emotions, fear, perhaps, or loyalty. Lady Eleanor, you knew of the codicil, did you not? And you feared for Clara's future." Lady Eleanor's face crumpled, and she nodded, her voice barely audible. I found the codicil a week ago in Reginald's desk. I was desperate to protect Clara. I didn't tell her, but I left the key behind the bookcase, hoping someone would find it and expose his plan. I never meant for him to die." The room gasped, and Clara clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face. Victor's expression softened, his hand tightening on Clara's. Grayson, stunned, scribbled furiously in his notebook. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion confirmed. The key was Lady Eleanor's silent cry for help, a way to reveal the codicil without directly betraying her husband. "It was a small act," Miss Marple said softly, "but it set the stage for others' sins. In my village, I once knew a woman who left a letter open, hoping her husband would read it and mend his ways. But secrets, once loosed, have a way of turning dangerous." Grayson cleared his throat. "Lady Haverford, you'll need to give a full statement, but it seems your actions, while misguided, weren't criminal." He turned to Miss Marple, his respect evident. "You've tied up every loose end, Miss Marple. I don't know how you do it." She smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, Inspector, it is simply a matter of seeing the pattern. People are like my knitting. Each stitch must be in its place, or the whole unravels." As the clock struck 9 a.m., the guests dispersed, their relief tempered by the weight of truth. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, prepared to return to St. Mary Mead. Mary Mead, her work in Blackthorn Manor complete. The tapestry was whole, its threads of greed, love, and fear woven into a pattern only her little grey cells could discern. Chapter 13. The Hidden Motive. The late morning of October 23rd, 1938, bathed Blackthorn Manor in a deceptive calm, the autumn sunlight streaming through the drawing-room's tall windows, casting intricate patterns on the polished floor. The revelations of the previous night, Dr. Malcolm Price's confession to murder, Beatrice Langley's admission of theft, and Lady Eleanor's reluctant disclosure about the brass key, had brought the case to a close, yet a faint undercurrent of unease lingered. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, sensed that one final thread of the mystery remained, a hidden motive that had driven the events to their tragic climax. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in the guests' demeanours. The drawing-room was quieter now, the breakfast table cleared, and the guests gathered in small clusters, their voices hushed. Lady Eleanor, her composure bolstered by Clara's presence, sat near the fireplace, her hands steady for the first time in days. Clara and Victor Crane, their hands entwined, spoke in low tones, their relief palpable but tempered by the shadow of the codicil. Beatrice Langley, under Constable Jenkins' watchful eye, maintained a strained dignity, her usual vivacity subdued. Inspector Grayson, reviewing his final report, prepared to depart for Scotland Yard, confident that the case was resolved. Yet Miss Marple, her mind as meticulous as her stitches, felt a nagging certainty that the full truth had not yet surfaced. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and approached Inspector Grayson, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Inspector," she said, "you have done admirable work, but I wonder if we might explore one last detail. The codicil, you see, revealed a motive for Clara and Victor, but also for Lady Eleanor. Yet there is another possibility, a motive hidden not in greed or love, but in fear. Might we speak with Mrs. Langley once more?" Grayson, though weary, nodded, accustomed to Miss Marple's uncanny insight. "Very well, Miss Marple. Let's hear what she has to say." He called Beatrice forward, who approached with a guarded expression, her hands clasped tightly around her handbag. "Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but probing, "you admitted to stealing the Book of Hours, a crime of ambition. But I wonder if there was more to your actions than you've shared." You were in the study before 10 p.m., using a candle to pry open the case. Did you see something or someone that made you fear for more than your reputation?" Beatrice's eyes widened, and for a moment her composure faltered. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I took the manuscript, yes, but I left before anything happened. I saw nothing." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "But you did, Mrs. Langley. Your perfume, rose and sandalwood, lingered near the study window, and your claim to have seen Sir Reginald alive at 10 o'clock contradicts Lady Eleanor's statement that the study was silent by 10:10. You were there longer than you admit. And I believe you saw Dr. Price enter the study, or perhaps you heard something that made you flee." The room fell silent, all eyes on Beatrice. Her lips parted, and she hesitated, her fingers tightening around her handbag. "You're guessing, Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp. "I told you I was gone by 10 o'clock." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice soft but unrelenting. "In my village, I once knew a woman who overheard a quarrel and kept silent, fearing it would implicate her in a theft. But silence, Mrs. Langley, can be as telling to words. You heard Dr. Price and Sir Reginald arguing, did you not? About the manuscript, perhaps, or something more personal?" Beatrice's face drained of colour, and she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I didn't want to say," she whispered. "I was in the servants' passage, hiding the manuscript in the library, when I heard raised voices from the study. It was Dr. Price, accusing Reginald of ruining him. Something about a debt, a loan Reginald had called in. I didn't stay to listen. I fled, leaving the manuscript behind." Grayson's eyes narrowed, his notebook snapping open. "A debt? Why didn't you mention this before, Mrs. Langley?" Beatrice's voice broke. "Because I was afraid. If I admitted being there, you'd think I was involved in the murder. I only wanted the manuscript, not this." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion confirmed. The motive for Dr. Price's crime was not just greed for the manuscript, but a deeper wound, a financial ruin orchestrated by Sir Reginald. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a man's desperation over a lost fortune had led to a violent outburst, hidden behind a facade of respectability. "Fear," she mused, "is a powerful spur, driving even the most rational to madness." She turned to Grayson. "Inspector, you might find it useful to examine Dr. Price's financial records. A debt to Sir Reginald, called in suddenly, would explain his rage. The manuscript was a symbol of his loss, but the true motive was personal, a need to reclaim his pride." Grayson nodded, signalling to Jenkins. "We'll look into it. If Price was ruined, it gives us the why behind the murder." He turned to Miss Marple, his respect unmistakable. "You've a way of seeing what we miss, Miss Marple. I'll be sure to mention your help in my report." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, Inspector, I am merely an old woman who notices things. People are like my knitting. Each stitch tells a story, and sometimes the smallest knot reveals the most." As the clock struck 10 a.m., the guests began to disperse, their relief now tinged with the weight of new truths. Clara and Victor, their future uncertain but their bond strengthened, thanked Miss Marple quietly. Lady Eleanor, her composure restored, offered a grateful nod. Beatrice, escorted by Jenkins for further questioning, cast a final glance at the Book of Hours, its allure now tarnished. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, prepared to leave Blackthorn Manor. The hidden motive Dr. Price's financial ruin had completed the tapestry, revealing a crime born of desperation, not just greed. As she stepped into the crisp morning air, she thought of Saint Mary Mead, where simpler puzzles awaited, but the human heart, she knew, would always be her greatest challenge. Chapter 14. The Final Stitches. The afternoon of October 23rd, 1938, brought a fragile peace to Blackthorn Manor, as if the house itself were exhaling after days of suffocating tension. The golden autumn light filtered through the drawing-room's windows, softening the edges of a room that had borne witness to betrayal, greed, and murder. The Book of Hours, now safely locked in Inspector Grayson's custody, no longer cast its spell, but its shadow lingered in the weary faces of the guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting needles clicking steadily, felt the weight of the case lifting. Yet her meticulous mind lingered on the final stitches of the tapestry. A few delicate threads that needed securing to ensure the pattern was complete. The drawing room was nearly empty now, the guests preparing to depart as the investigation concluded. Lady Eleanor, her strength slowly returning, sat with Clara, their hands clasped in quiet solidarity. Victor Crane, his defiance softened by gratitude, stood nearby, his eyes no longer darting with suspicion. Beatrice Langley, released after her statement about the theft, had retreated to her room, her usual poise replaced by a subdued resignation. Inspector Grayson, packing his notes, exchanged a few words with Constable Jenkins, who would remain to oversee the manor's security until Scotland Yard finalised the case. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the clues that had unravelled the mystery: the waxy smudge on the letter opener, the heel print in the flower bed, the torn letter fragments, the brass key, and Beatrice's revelation about Dr. Price's financial ruin. Each had played its part, but it was the human element, the motives of greed, fear, and loyalty that had woven them together. Yet one detail nagged at her. The clink Lady Eleanor had heard in the corridor at 10:05, a sound she had attributed to a metal object, possibly the brass key. Had it been dropped by Beatrice Doctor, Price, or someone else entirely? Approaching Lady Eleanor, Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice warm but probing. "Lady Eleanor, you've been most brave through this ordeal. I wonder, though, about that clink you heard near the study. You said it was like metal falling. Could it have been something other than the key? A piece of jewellery, perhaps? Or a small tool?" Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, and she hesitated, her fingers touching the brooch at her collar. I'm not sure, Miss Marple. It was so faint and I was so frightened. But now that you mention it, it sounded like something small, like a pin or a clasp, hitting the floor." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. The sound suggested a careless moment, a clue to someone's presence in the corridor. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a dropped earring had betrayed a maid's eavesdropping, leading to the discovery of a stolen will. Small things, she mused, so often betray the largest secrets. She turned to Inspector Grayson, who was preparing to leave. "Inspector, before you go, might we take one final look at the servants' passage? Lady Eleanor's clink may hold the last piece of our puzzle. In my village, I once found a lost button that pointed to a thief's path." Grayson, though eager to conclude the case, respected Miss Marple's instincts. "Very well, Miss Marple. Let's see what we find." He led the way to the narrow passage, where the dim light and faded portraits created an air of secrecy. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp, examined the floor near the door to the terrace, where she had found the wax fleck and the smudge of dirt. There, glinting faintly in a crack between the floorboards, was a small silver hairpin, its tip bent as if used to pry something open. Grayson retrieved it, his brow furrowing. A hairpin? Mrs. Langley said she used one to open the glass case. Could this be hers? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Perhaps, Inspector, but it may also belong to another. The hairpin suggests someone else was in this passage, perhaps assisting or observing Mrs. Langley's theft. I wonder if we might ask Clara a final question. She was upset that night, and her hairpin, I noticed, was missing from her hair after dinner. Clara, summoned to the passage, looked startled but nodded when shown the hairpin. It's mine," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I lost it that evening, but I didn't think I was in my room, Miss Marple, I swear." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "Of course, my dear, but you were in the corridor earlier, were you not? Perhaps you dropped it while passing the study, intending to meet Victor, as the note suggested." Clara's eyes filled with tears. I did go toward the study, around 9:50, to talk to Father about Victor. But I heard voices, Mrs. Langley, I think, and someone else. I was afraid, so I turned back. I must have lost the hairpin then." Miss Marple nodded, the final thread falling into place. The hairpin confirmed Clara's presence near the study, but her retreat explained her absence during the murder. Beatrice's theft had been witnessed, unwittingly, by Clara, whose dropped hairpin had marked her fleeting presence. The clink Lady Eleanor heard was likely the pin hitting the floor, a small accident that tied the events together. Grayson, satisfied, added the hairpin to his evidence. "This clears up the last loose end, Miss Marple. Clara's not involved, but her presence explains the timing. You've a knack for finding what we overlook." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, Inspector, it is merely a matter of patience. In my knitting, a single dropped stitch can unravel a whole row, but with care it can be mended. People, you see, are much the same." As the clock struck 2 p.m., the guests prepared to leave Blackthorn Manor, their lives forever altered by the truth. Miss Marple, her reticule packed, bid farewell to Lady Eleanor and Clara, her heart lightened by their gratitude. The final stitches were in place, the tapestry complete, and she looked forward to the quiet of St. Mary Mead, where simpler puzzles awaited her little grey cells. Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The late afternoon of October 23rd, 1938, cast a golden glow over Blackthorn Manor, the autumn sun sinking low, painting the ivy-clad walls with hues of amber and crimson. The manor, though scarred by the events of the past days, seemed to breathe more freely, as if the resolution of Sir Reginald Haverford's murder had lifted a weight from its ancient stones. The guests, their bags packed and their farewells subdued, prepared to leave, each carrying the burden of truths revealed. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting neatly folded in her reticule, stood in the entrance hall, her slight figure framed by the grand oak doors, ready to return to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. Yet her mind, ever active, lingered on the final moments of the case, ensuring no thread remained unknotted. The hall was a flurry of subdued activity. Lady Eleanor, her composure restored, stood with Clara, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. Victor Crane, his arm around Clara, offered a nod of gratitude to Miss Marple, his earlier suspicion replaced by respect. Beatrice Langley, escorted by Constable Jenkins to face charges for theft, passed through with a tight-lipped smile, her ambition chastened, but her spirit unbroken. Inspector Grayson, his report complete, shook hands with the manor's staff, his gruff demeanour softened by the case's resolution. The Book of Hours, secured for return to its rightful place, rested in a locked case under Grayson's supervision, its allure no longer a catalyst for tragedy. Miss Marple, adjusting her shawl, approached Lady Eleanor, her voice gentle but clear. "My dear, you and Clara will find your way forward, I'm sure. The truth, though painful, often clears the path for healing. In my village, I once saw a family mend after a theft was uncovered, simply because they faced it together." Lady Eleanor's eyes glistened, and she clasped Miss Marple's hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your kindness and your insight have saved us from more than just suspicion. Clara's future is uncertain, but we are stronger for it." Clara, her face softer now, added, "I'll never forget what you've done, Miss Marple. You saw what we couldn't. Victor and I might have been lost without you." Miss Marple smiled, her pale blue eyes twinkling. "Oh, my dear, it is merely a matter of looking closely. People are like my knitting, tangled at times, but with patience, the pattern emerges. You and Mr. Crane must take care to choose your stitches wisely from now on." Victor, clearing his throat, managed a sheepish grin. "I misjudged you, Miss Marple. Thought you were just well, you know, but you're sharper than any detective." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Youth is often impatient, Mr. Crane, but age has its virtues. I have learned that the heart of a mystery lies not in the crime, but in the why, the fears, loves, and secrets that drive us." As Grayson prepared to depart, he approached Miss Marple, his moustache twitching with a rare smile. "Miss Marple, Scotland Yard could use someone like you. The wax, the key, the hairpin. You tied it all together when we were chasing shadows. How do you do it?" She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Oh, Inspector, it is no great secret. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen human nature in all its forms. Greed in a grocer, jealousy in a maid, loyalty in a friend. The clues, you see, are not just in objects, but in people. Their glances, their hesitations, their silences. Dr. Price's despair, Mrs. Langley's ambition, Lady Eleanor's fear for Clara, they all left traces, like stitches in a tapestry." Grayson nodded, jotting a final note. "Well, your tapestry's complete, and I'll make sure Scotland Yard knows it. Safe travels back to your village." As the clock struck 4 p.m., Miss Marple stepped into the waiting car, her reticule tucked under her arm. The manor's gravel drive crunched under the tires as she gazed out at the rolling hills, their beauty untouched by the darkness within. She thought of the waxy smudge, the heel print, the torn letter, the brass key, and the hairpin, each a small detail, yet each essential to the truth. She recalled her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose tales of village gossip had taught her that no secret, however small, could hide forever. The car wound through the countryside, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead, where her cottage, her garden, and her neighbours awaited. There would be new puzzles, no doubt, perhaps a missing brooch, or a quarrel over a will, but none would be as intricate as Blackthorn Manor's tragedy. Yet she knew, with quiet certainty, that her little grey cells would be ready, as always, to unravel the next knot in the tapestry of human nature. As the manor faded from view, Miss Marple opened her reticule, retrieving her knitting. The needles began their familiar rhythm, a quiet promise that wherever she went, she would carry her keen observation, her gentle wisdom, and her unyielding pursuit of truth. The church bell tolled in the distance, marking 4:30 p.m., and Miss Marple smiled, content to leave Blackthorn Manor to its healing and return to the simplicity of home.